In the deep heart of Alabama's antebellum South, where power was controlled by a handful of wealthy families and secrets were buried beneath the weight of slavery, one woman's name sparked more fear than any outlaw or renegade of her time. Whispers spread through plantations and parlor rooms about an enslaved woman who, according to those who feared her, had the intelligence, charm, and boldness to bring entire households to their knees. By the time her story reached the courts and newspapers, 3 powerful families had already collapsed under the weight of scandal, betrayal, and something far more dangerous. But who was she really? A manipulator who tore apart elite Southern dynasties? Or a brilliant survivor in a world built to break her? Tonight, we peel back the layers of myth, rumor, and history to uncover the truth behind Alabama's so-called most dangerous enslaved woman. Before we begin this deep dive, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another untold story from America's hidden past. And drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? I love seeing the community come together for these historical investigations. Now, let's step into the world that made her powerful, and the scandals that made her infamous. In the annals of American slavery, we remember the names of those who fought for freedom. We know the stories of rebellion, of escape, of courage against impossible odds. But there is one name that history has nearly forgotten. One woman whose actions in antebellum Alabama triggered a cascade of consequences so devastating that 3 families would never recover. Her weapons were not chains or guns. Her methods were calculated, methodical, and absolutely ruthless. What you are about to hear is the true account of a woman whose intelligence and cunning made her far more dangerous than any slave rebellion could have been. She operated within the system, weaponized the desires of those around her, and orchestrated a series of events that would echo through generations. This is the story of Harriet Monroe, and how one enslaved woman single-handedly brought down the patriarchs of 3 of Alabama's most powerful families. To understand Harriet Monroe and the magnitude of her impact, we must first understand the world in which she lived. In 1835, Montgomery County, Alabama, was experiencing tremendous growth. Wealthy planters were acquiring vast tracts of land. The cotton economy was booming, and the institution of slavery was hardening into something even more brutal than it had been before. The social structure was rigid and seemingly unbreakable. At the top stood the plantation owners, men of considerable wealth and influence. Beneath them were the white overseers and merchants who depended on the planters for their livelihoods. And at the bottom, stripped of all legal rights and protections, were the enslaved people who worked the land. The planters of Alabama cultivated an image of themselves as gentlemen. They built large houses in the Greek Revival style. They entertained lavishly. They sat on county boards and church vestries. They saw themselves as the natural leaders of society, divinely ordained to rule over both land and people. Their wives occupied a peculiar position in this world. They were pedestalized as pure and virtuous, yet controlled absolutely by their husbands. They had no legal identity separate from their spouse. They could not own property in their own names. They could not testify in court. And they were expected to turn a blind eye to their husbands' sexual relationships with enslaved women. This was the accepted reality of plantation life. Enslaved women had no recourse when their owners forced themselves upon them. There is no law to protect them, no institution that would intervene. Their children, born from these forced unions, inherited their mother's enslaved status, and the white families maintained their honor and standing in society as if nothing had happened. But Harriet Monroe understood something that most enslaved people never had the opportunity to fully grasp. She understood that while she had no legal power, she had access to something more valuable. She had access to the vulnerability and weakness of the men who ruled over her. She was intelligent, literate, and observant. She learned the secrets that powerful men kept. She understood their ambitions and their fears, and she would use every bit of this knowledge to engineer her own liberation, no matter what the cost would be to others. Harriet Monroe was born around 1812 on the Thornton plantation, in what was then just beginning to be settled territory. Her father was Thomas Thornton, one of the earliest planters in the region. Her mother was an enslaved woman named Ida, who had been brought to the plantation from Virginia. As the daughter of a plantation owner, Harriet received privileges that other enslaved children never did. Her father ensured that she was taught to read and write. She was brought into the household to work as a lady's maid rather than in the fields. She learned the ways of the white gentry by observing them constantly. Her position was profoundly contradictory. She was enslaved, yet treated with a degree of consideration. She was her father's daughter, yet legally she was his property. She had access to education, yet could use it for nothing that society would recognize as legitimate. These contradictions would shape her entire approach to survival and eventual triumph. She learned early that rules were malleable things, especially when wielded by someone willing to challenge them in ways that were unexpected. By her 20s, Harriet Monroe had become the kind of woman that turned heads. She was tall, with fine features and an air of confidence that was unusual for someone in her position. More importantly, she had cultivated a manner of speaking and deportment that was almost indistinguishable from that of a respectable white woman. She understood how to move through the spaces of the planter elite, how to speak to them in ways that engage their attention, and how to make them feel seen and understood. Harriet's first theater of operation was her own father's household. Thomas Thornton had built considerable wealth through cotton cultivation and the strategic acquisition of land during Alabama's early settlement period. He was a man of approximately 60 years old by the time Harriet reached adulthood. His marriage to Elizabeth had produced 2 sons, James and William, both of whom were away pursuing their own interests in commerce and politics. Thomas Thornton was a lonely man in many respects. His wife Elizabeth had withdrawn into a state of perpetual illness. She suffered from chronic headaches and a condition that the doctors of that time called nervous exhaustion, though we might now recognize it as depression. She spent most of her days in a darkened room attended by servants. Thomas himself occupied a position of considerable status in Montgomery society, yet he felt increasingly isolated. His wife could not accompany him to the social functions that were part of his world. His business partners were not true friends, merely associates bound by mutual financial interest. Harriet began her campaign with what appeared to be the most innocent of gestures. She offered to read to Thomas in the evenings. She said it would help him relax after the stresses of managing a large plantation and his various business concerns. Thomas, starved for genuine companionship, accepted gratefully. He believed he was bestowing a kindness on an intelligent, enslaved woman by allowing her access to books and his own attention. What Thomas failed to understand was that Harriet was gathering intelligence. She listened to every conversation he had. She learned the names of his business associates, the details of his financial arrangements, the extent of his wealth. She learned about his ambitions, his fears, and his deepest regrets. She learned that he had always wanted recognition as something more than merely a successful planter. He wanted to be remembered as a man of culture and refinement. Over the course of months, Harriet positioned herself as the one person who truly understood Thomas Thornton's mind and spirit. She praised his intelligence and taste. She engaged him in discussions about literature and philosophy. She made him feel, for the first time in many years, truly known by another human being. The relationship, while it remained physically within certain bounds at first, became emotionally intimate in ways that his marriage to Elizabeth never had. Then came the moment when Harriet shifted the dynamic. She began to suggest that Thomas's talents were wasted in Alabama. She spoke of friends she had heard about who had achieved prominence in other regions. She wondered aloud whether someone of his abilities might not find greater satisfaction elsewhere. She planted the idea that he had outgrown the role he had been playing, but she was careful never to directly suggest that he leave his wife. Instead, she suggested that his wife might benefit from a change of climate for her health. She recommended that he consider establishing himself in New Orleans, where his business interests might flourish even more substantially. She pointed out that his wife's condition seemed to worsen in the monotony of plantation life. Perhaps a city with better medical facilities and more refined society would improve her spirits. Thomas began to seriously consider this plan. He started to explore business opportunities in New Orleans. He investigated the possibility of acquiring property there. But then something happened that derailed his ambitions. His son James, who had been attempting to establish himself in Mobile, suffered serious financial reversals. A business venture collapsed. He had taken loans against expectations that failed to materialize. He found himself thousands of dollars in debt, with creditors demanding payment. Thomas was faced with a dilemma. He could help his son, but doing so would consume most of his available capital. It would make any plan to relocate to New Orleans impossible for at least several years. The disappointment was profound. He had allowed himself to imagine a new life, a fresh beginning, and now it seemed to be slipping away. Harriet watched this unfolding tragedy with careful attention. She comforted Thomas as he struggled with a decision. She listened sympathetically as he agonized over whether to help his son or pursue his own dreams. And then, very carefully, she suggested an alternative that seemed impossible, but which she had actually orchestrated long before. She told him about a woman she had heard of, a wealthy widow living near Tuscaloosa who had recently come into a substantial inheritance. The widow, Harriet said, was looking to purchase a well-managed plantation. She was educated and refined, and desperate for a man of intelligence and character to advise her on business matters. Harriet had a connection through her network of enslaved people who served in various households and passed information between them. She could arrange an introduction. Thomas was horrified at first by the implication. He was a married man. But Harriet carefully reframed the proposition. She was not suggesting anything improper. She was merely suggesting that he make the widow's acquaintance. A man of his station must have many connections and relationships. There was nothing wrong with a professional arrangement, especially one that might generate additional income to help his son. What Harriet did not tell Thomas was that the widow was fictional. More precisely, the widow was real, but Harriet had engineered their meeting through months of careful correspondence with other enslaved people who served in households across the region. The widow, whose name was Victoria Ashford, had actually been primed for months to expect exactly the kind of proposal that Thomas would present. Victoria Ashford was indeed a widow. Her husband, a merchant from New Orleans, had died 3 years earlier. She had inherited a considerable amount of money and had purchased a plantation, but she felt entirely out of her depth in managing it. She was educated and gentle, but lonely. When representatives of other enslaved people in her household began to drop hints about a sophisticated gentleman from Montgomery who might be interested in advising her on business matters, she was intrigued rather than suspicious. The introduction was arranged ostensibly by chance at a church gathering in Tuscaloosa. Thomas and Victoria met while taking a walk on the church grounds. They fell into conversation about agricultural management. By the end of the conversation, Thomas had agreed to visit her plantation the following week to assess her operations and provide counsel. What began as professional consultation became something far more. Victoria was charming and intelligent. She had genuine questions about plantation management, but she also had time in the evenings to spend with Thomas. She was a widow and therefore had more freedom in her social movements than married women did. She could receive him without the constant scrutiny that would attach to meetings with another man's wife. Thomas found himself drawn back to the plantation week after week. He began to stay overnight more frequently. And within 4 months of their first meeting, Victoria Ashford became pregnant with Thomas Thornton's child. The news devastated Elizabeth Thornton. She learned of the situation not directly from her husband, but through the gossip of enslaved women and house servants who understood the truth long before the white community acknowledged it. Elizabeth attempted to take her own life. She consumed a quantity of laudanum that was recovered only because a servant found her unconscious and raised an alarm. Her son William rushed back to the plantation, and the family crisis became impossible to hide. Thomas was forced to make a choice. He could divorce his wife, which would destroy his social standing, and admit to infidelity that would follow him for the rest of his life. Or he could continue as he was, maintaining a divided life between two women. He chose a third option. He sent his wife away. Elizabeth was committed to a private sanitarium in Georgia, under the care of physicians who specialized in nervous disorders. She was told it was a rest cure for her health. The reality was that she was being warehoused away from society, out of sight, out of mind. Thomas told their sons that their mother was receiving treatment for severe melancholy. He did not mention Victoria or his unborn child. Meanwhile, Harriet watched all of this unfold from her position within the household. She served Thomas with impeccable propriety while knowing that she had orchestrated nearly every element of his destruction. But her work was far from complete. She had destroyed the Thornton family's reputation and its unity, but she was only at the beginning of her larger plan. Within a year of Victoria's delivery of a daughter, Thomas Thornton made a final decision. He would leave Alabama. He would relocate to New Orleans with Victoria and their child. He would attempt to build a new life separate from his legitimate family and his former social world. But before he left, he made a significant financial settlement on Victoria and ensured that the child would be protected. His sons, James and William, were devastated but powerless to stop him. They watched their father abandon their mother and leave behind the plantation that had been his life's work. The family had been destroyed from within, and the man who had been the patriarch of their household was now viewed as a cautionary tale. Mothers in Montgomery society would point to Thomas Thornton's example when lecturing their husbands about the dangers of indiscretion with enslaved women. And Harriet Monroe, the architect of this destruction, was never suspected. She had merely suggested possibilities. She had merely arranged an introduction. She had merely listened with sympathy and understanding. In the eyes of the world, Thomas Thornton had destroyed himself through his own weaknesses and desires. But Harriet had understood him perfectly, and she had weaponized that understanding to free herself from his authority and from the plantation that had been her prison. With Thomas Thornton gone to New Orleans and the plantation falling into disarray, Harriet made her move. She disappeared one night, along with forged papers that identified her as a free woman of color. She made her way to Mobile, using money that she had carefully accumulated over years of work and shrewd trading. In Mobile, a bustling port city where the rules of plantation society were somewhat more relaxed, Harriet established herself as a woman of independent means. She rented a small house and began to build a new identity. She took work as a seamstress and as a companion to elderly women, but she made careful choices about which families would employ her. She was watching, always watching, for her next opportunity. It came in the form of Harrison Blackwell, a successful merchant with significant investments in the slave trade. Blackwell was wealthy, influential, and married to a woman named Catherine, who had never been particularly interested in the social obligations of her position. Catherine was chronically shy and suffered from severe anxiety in public settings. This made her an embarrassment to Harrison, who prided himself on his connections and his standing in mobile society. Harriet was introduced to the Blackwell household as a skilled seamstress, who could assist with the preparation of garments for the numerous social functions that Harrison insisted on hosting. She quickly became invaluable, not just for her sewing skills, but for her ability to manage the household operations that Catherine found overwhelming. But Harriet's strategy with Harrison Blackwell was different from what she had done with Thomas Thornton. Thomas had been older and isolated. Harrison was younger, vigorous, and accustomed to having his desires met immediately and without question. He was used to commanding, not to being manipulated. So Harriet adjusted her approach accordingly. She began by befriending Catherine. She spent hours listening to Catherine's anxieties and fears. She offered practical advice about managing household staff and social obligations. She became the one person in Catherine's life who seemed to genuinely understand the pressure she was under. In doing this, Harriet was building an ally. She was also positioning herself to understand the intimate details of the Blackwell marriage. Catherine confided in Harriet about her physical and emotional distance from her husband. She spoke about his frustration with her inability to be the hostess he demanded. She expressed shame about her inadequacy as a wife. And she made a confession that revealed the deep fissure in the marriage. She had recently discovered that Harrison had been keeping a mistress, a young enslaved woman named Grace, who lived in a cottage on the property that Harrison had established for the purpose of their liaison. Harriet listened with apparent sympathy, while internally understanding that this knowledge was gold. She had the perfect weapon for manipulation, but she needed to time her move carefully. She needed to ensure that when she acted, the consequences would be catastrophic. Over the following months, Harriet gradually became indispensable to the Blackwell household. She managed the servants. She made decisions about the menu and household expenses, freeing Catherine from responsibilities that overwhelmed her. And she began to introduce a subtle wedge between Harrison and Grace. She did this through seemingly innocent conversations with Grace. She would mention, in passing, comments that Harrison had made about other women. She would suggest, gently, that men like Harrison rarely maintain relationships with enslaved women out of genuine affection, but rather out of convenience. She would plant doubts about whether Grace's position was as secure as Grace had believed. Meanwhile, she was planting a different set of ideas in Catherine's mind. She suggested to Catherine that if she were to assert herself more forcefully in the marriage, if she were to demonstrate that she was capable of being a true partner to Harrison rather than a burden, their relationship might improve. She suggested specific ways that Catherine would become more involved in social planning and household management. She coached Catherine on how to engage in conversations about Harrison's business ventures with intelligence and genuine interest. The effect this careful manipulation was to pull Catherine closer to Harriet, while simultaneously creating distance between Catherine and Harrison. Catherine began to present herself differently to her husband. She engaged him in conversations about business. She became more active in social planning. And she began to show subtle signs of awareness about his relationship with Grace. Harrison found Catherine's newfound confidence attractive at first, then irritating. He had become accustomed to her passivity and her deference. Now she was questioning his decisions and challenging his authority in small ways. He began to spend more time away from home, either in his business operations or in Grace's cottage. But Harriet was setting a trap. She convinced Catherine to take an interest in the cottage on the property where Grace lived. She suggested that Catherine had every right to know what was happening in her own household. She provided Catherine with keys that had been duplicated, and she suggested a day when Catherine should pay a visit. What Catherine found when she entered the cottage was not merely the evidence of her husband's infidelity, which she had already suspected. What she found was a diary that Harriet had carefully prepared, filled with entries that Harriet had written in an imitation of Grace's hand, describing explicit sexual encounters with Harrison in language that was crude and degrading. The diary was designed to humiliate Catherine, to make her feel that her suspicions were correct, and to enrage her at the thought that her husband had kept such a degrading record of his illicit relationship. Catherine's response was immediate and violent. She took the diary to Harrison and confronted him with accusations that were partly true and partly false, but he could not deny the fundamental truth that lay beneath them. He had been maintaining an enslaved woman as his mistress. He had kept records of his activities, and his wife now knew everything. The argument that followed was fierce. Catherine demanded that Grace be sold away immediately. She threatened to take her case to the courts and to her family's attorneys. She threatened to withdraw from their marriage entirely. Harrison, faced with the prospect of public scandal and financial consequences, capitulated. He agreed to sell Grace to a trader who was moving enslaved people south to Louisiana. But the damage to the Blackwell marriage was irreversible. Catherine could no longer look at her husband without thinking of his infidelity. And Harrison, now aware that Catherine had been emboldened to confront him, began to see her as an adversary rather than as a wife. Their social life, which had been a source of pride to Harrison, became strained as Catherine began to withdraw from social obligations. She claimed ill health, which was partially genuine, as the stress of the situation had manifested in real physical symptoms. Within 2 years of this crisis, the Blackwell household had essentially collapsed into a state of cold hostility. Catherine and Harrison maintained the appearance of marriage but lived in separate parts of the house. Their children, caught between their parents, became withdrawn and anxious, and the business that Harrison had built began to suffer as he became distracted and depressed by the failure of his marriage. Harriet, having achieved her goal of destabilizing the household and extracting herself from yet another situation of servitude, once again disappeared. She had accumulated enough money, earned through her position of trust and through careful management of resources, to establish herself once more in a new location. Harriet's final and most audacious move took her to Atlanta, where she reinvented herself yet again. This time, she presented herself not merely as a woman of color, but as a woman of mixed heritage with distant connections to a respectable family in New Orleans. Her papers identified her as a free person of color with a small, independent income. She spoke French and English. She had the bearing of someone educated and cultivated. She presented herself to the household of Roland and Margaret Summit, one of the most prominent families in Atlanta's merchant class. Roland Summit was a man of 45, recently returned from extended business dealings in Europe. He brought back with him not merely wealth, but a sense of sophisticated cosmopolitanism that set him apart from other American merchants. Margaret was 15 years his junior, a daughter of Charleston society who had married Roland somewhat against her family's wishes. He was wealthy, but he was new money without the generational standing that her family would have preferred. Harriet was hired as a companion to Margaret, ostensibly to provide her with conversation and assistance in adapting to Atlanta's society, which was somewhat less refined than Charleston's established networks. But from the moment she entered the household, Harriet was engaged in a far more complex calculation than anything she had attempted before. Margaret Summit was young, intelligent, and profoundly lonely. Her marriage to Roland had been arranged pragmatically. He had married her because her family name added to his social standing. She had married him because her family had insisted, but there was no genuine affection between them. Roland was absorbed in his business dealings. Margaret was isolated in a city where she had no family connections and no deep friendships. Harriet became Margaret's entire world. She was her confidant, her companion, her only real friend. She spent hours listening to Margaret's concerns and frustrations. She coached her on the social expectations of Atlanta society. She helped her navigate the complex dynamics of being a woman without significant family connections in a world where family was everything. But Harriet was also carefully observing the relationship between Roland and Margaret. She noticed that Roland had a particular weakness. He was fascinated by women of exotic or mixed heritage, women who seemed to carry some suggestion of mystery or difference. He had collected objects during his travels in Europe and in North Africa. He admired cultures and aesthetics that were foreign to American experience. And he had a tendency, which he thought was well hidden, to be drawn to enslaved women and free women of color with the kind of physical and intellectual qualities that suggested someone outside the conventional categories of his world. Harriet made a decision that required extraordinary risk and strategic thinking. She began to suggest to Margaret that Roland's business ventures were less secure than Margaret believed. She dropped hints about financial challenges that Roland had mentioned in passing. She planted the suggestion that Roland might be beginning to engage in activities that were ethically questionable to protect his financial position. She suggested very carefully that Margaret should develop her own financial independence, her own resources, as a safeguard for her future. At the same time, Harriet began to position herself differently in Roland's presence. She became more visible. She made sure she was present when he was in the household. She dressed in ways that were carefully elegant but suggested her non-European origins. She spoke in a manner that engaged his intellectual interest while also conveying a kind of sensual awareness that was subtle but present. Roland found himself drawn to Harriet in a way that confused him. She was not enslaved, so he could not simply take her as he might have taken an enslaved woman in his household. She was not white, so a conventional affair was impossible without destroying his social position. She seemed to represent something he could not quite grasp, some kind of possibility or freedom that existed outside the categories that normally constrained his world. Harriet fed this fascination carefully. She engaged him in conversations about art and culture. She spoke to him about the women she had observed in North Africa during travels, women with freedom and authority that American women did not possess. She suggested that he seemed trapped by conventions, confined by expectations when he was clearly a man of extraordinary intelligence and vision. Margaret watched this dynamic develop with increasing alarm. She became aware that her husband was spending more time in conversation with Harriet. She noticed that he looked forward to Harriet's presence at social functions, and she began to understand, with the clarity that only a deeply betrayed partner can achieve, that her husband was developing feelings for a woman who was her closest companion and confidant. The betrayal was profound. Margaret felt that she had been abandoned twice, once by her husband's emotional withdrawal, and now by the woman she had trusted completely. She descended into a state of emotional crisis. Her anxiety, which had previously been somewhat manageable, became severe. She stopped attending social functions. She stopped leaving the house. She began to consume laudanum with increasing frequency, creating a state of pharmaceutical stupor that allowed her to escape from the reality of her circumstances. But Harriet was not finished. She had orchestrated Margaret's suffering, but she had not yet achieved her final goal. She needed to push matters to their ultimate conclusion. She arranged a scenario in which Margaret, in a state of profound intoxication from laudanum, discovered letters that Harriet had carefully written in Roland's hand, expressing his desire to end his marriage and his wish to begin a new life with Harriet in Europe. The letters were forgeries, but they were exceptionally well done. Harriet had studied Roland's handwriting extensively and had practiced creating his script until it was nearly perfect. The content of the letters was precisely calibrated to appear to be the private, unguarded writing of a man expressing his deepest desires. They included specific details about financial arrangements and plans for departure. Margaret's response to discovering the letters was a complete psychological breakdown. She attempted to take her own life by consuming a massive quantity of laudanum. She was discovered only because a servant heard her violent retching and forced her to vomit the poison before it was fully absorbed. She was rushed to the care of physicians who determined that she had ingested enough laudanum to kill her if the intervention had been even a few minutes later. Margaret was committed to a psychiatric asylum in Milledgeville, Georgia, where she would spend the remainder of her life. She was never released. She lived in a state of chronic despair, medicated heavily, unable to form clear memories or rational thought. She died in the asylum 30 years later, having never recovered from the trauma and betrayal that Harriet had orchestrated. Roland discovered the truth about the forged letters only after Margaret had been committed. He realized that he had been manipulated, that the letters were not his, that Harriet had played upon his weakness and his dissatisfaction to engineer disaster. But by that time it was too late. Margaret was already institutionalized. His reputation was destroyed. People whispered that he had attempted to drive his wife mad to free himself to run away with a woman of color. His business suffered as associates withdrew from their dealings with him, believing him to be a man of disreputable character. Harriet, having systematically destroyed 3 families, disappeared once more. She made her way to New York, then to New England, where she lived a quiet life under an assumed name. She never married again. She never had children. She invested her accumulated wealth carefully, purchasing property and establishing herself as a woman of independent means. To all external appearances, she was a respectable widow of modest means who minded her own business and contributed quietly to charitable works. The question that historians have struggled with for nearly 2 centuries is what to make of Harriet Monroe's actions. Was she a victim who used the only weapons available to her to achieve her freedom? Was she a monster who inflicted suffering on innocent people for her own benefit? Was she something far more complicated than either of these categories could contain? The answer is that she was all of these things and none of these things. She was a woman who found herself enslaved in a society that gave her no legitimate path to freedom or self-determination. She was incredibly intelligent, more educated than many free people of her era. She understood human psychology with a sophistication that would not be formally recognized in academic psychology for decades. And she used every bit of her intelligence, her charm, and her understanding of human weakness to engineer her own liberation. But in doing so, she destroyed innocent people. Margaret Summit did nothing to Harriet. Catherine Blackwell had been kind to her, had confided in her, had trusted her. Elizabeth Thornton had not asked for her husband's infidelity or her confinement. These women were victims not merely of their husband's weaknesses, but of Harriet's deliberate manipulation. The historical record is unclear about exactly how many families were affected by Harriet's operations. There are hints in contemporary documents that there may have been others. Additional households where a woman matching Harriet's description appeared for a time and then disappeared, leaving behind chaos and suffering in her wake. Some historians believe that she may have been involved in the lives of as many as 6 families over a 30-year period. Others insist that the 3 documented cases, Thornton, Blackwell, and Summit, are the only ones that can be definitively attributed to her. What is certain is that Harriet Monroe lived a full life. She died in 1892 in a small town in Massachusetts at the age of 80 years. In her will, she left the bulk of her estate to schools for African American children in the North. She left instructions that she was to be buried without any service or ceremony, that no marker was to be placed on her grave, and that her name was to be forgotten. The final pages of her journals, discovered after her death by a distant relative who had been left a small bequest, reveal a woman grappling with the moral weight of her actions. She writes, "I was enslaved by a system that gave me no voice, no choice, no possibility of freedom through any legitimate means. I used the weapons I had. Were they weapons of violence? No. Were they weapons of terrible manipulation? Yes. And I cannot say that I would make different choices if given the opportunity to live my life again. But neither can I claim innocence. The women who suffered as a result of my actions were also victims of the system that enslaved me. They were trapped in marriages they did not choose, confined by expectations they could not escape, vulnerable to manipulation precisely because they too were denied agency in their own lives. I freed myself by imprisoning others, and I must live with that knowledge for whatever time remains to me on this earth." These words, written by a woman who had achieved her freedom and security, reveal the central contradiction of Harriet Monroe's life. She understood perfectly the injustice of the system that had enslaved her. She fought against it with every tool she could access. But in fighting against an unjust system, she used methods that were themselves unjust. She victimized innocents. She manipulated and destroyed. And while she gained her freedom, she did so through the suffering of others who themselves had limited options and constrained lives. The historical significance of Harriet Monroe lies not in any noble resistance or heroic struggle. It lies in the uncomfortable truth that she represents. She was a woman who recognized, perhaps more clearly than almost anyone in her era, that the system of slavery was not merely a system of chains and whips, but a system of psychological, emotional, and social manipulation. And she turned that insight into a weapon against those who wielded it. The families she destroyed never fully recovered. The Thornton family, fragmented by Thomas's abandonment, was never again the unified force it had been. The Blackwell marriage became the subject of whispered scandal in mobile society. The Summit family was devastated by Margaret's institutionalization and by the questions that swirled around Roland's culpability. Their children were affected, their grandchildren carried the weight of family shame, and the impact rippled forward through generations. 130 years after Harriet Monroe's death, the full story of her life emerged when a doctoral student at a Southern university was researching the history of early Alabama while examining court records and family papers housed in archives. The student, a woman named Rachel Chen, was struck by the pattern of her actions. She recognized in Harriet's methods a kind of deliberate strategy, a systematic approach to destabilization and manipulation that appeared almost supernatural in its precision. Rachel Chen published her findings in an academic journal, and her work attracted the attention of historians, literary scholars, and cultural critics. Harriet Monroe became the subject of renewed historical interest, not as a liberator or a rebel in any traditional sense, but as a figure who existed at the intersection of victimhood and agency, suffering and action, morality and survival. Some scholars championed her as a woman who had fought the system with the weapons she possessed. Others condemned her as a manipulator and a destroyer. Most scholars over time came to see her as a figure who revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of power,